All right, let's stay with the International Day of UN Peacekeeping. We cross live to our correspondent in New York, often at the UN, Sherwin Bryce-Pease. Thank you for being with us. Sherwin, let's start with South Africa, involved in peacekeeping efforts in the DRC. What's the relationship with the UN and what's our involvement?
It's a very strong relationship. You will be aware of the fact that South Africa withdrew its contingent, its SANDF contingents from the Darfur mission in Sudan. Of course, the Darfur conflict between various militias and the Sudanese government, a long-standing war. But things there have improved over the last decade. So South Africa withdrawing its troops, but very much one of the big investors certainly in terms of boots on the ground and in terms of the peacekeeping force in the DRC. South Africa very much involved in the Force Intervention Brigade, an offensive posture from UN peacekeeping that we haven't seen anywhere in the world, given just the broad nature of the conflict in the eastern DRC, the multitude of militias, foreign forces. So very much involved there, but of course also being overshadowed in some instances, Francis, by allegations of sexual exploitation and abuse that we have reported widely here, certainly from the United Nations on that.
South Africans involved in those allegations, unfortunately, Sherwin.
Absolutely. Of course, the UN now updating us on sexual exploitation and abuse in quarterly bulletins. And, of course, the last quarterly bulletin reflecting that there were 9 new cases. Of course, the UN was also very concerned that as much as South Africa was very much in a position to investigate these allegations, taking a very proactive position in terms of that, there was a great deal of concern emanating from the United Nations. I'm sorry, I'm hearing some noise in my ear. Can you hear me?
Sherwin, we can, and just carry on. Please ignore the interference.
I was just talking about the relationship in terms of the United Nations and the South African government in terms of addressing sexual exploitation and abuse allegations against its troops, that the South Africans have adopted a zero-tolerance approach, and that really now fitting into what the United Nations is expecting. The Secretary-General, one of his big reactions to SEA in the organization has been the appointment of a special coordinator, Jane Hole-Lute, who a few weeks ago presented some of the findings of her latest report. Francis, why don't we listen to what she had to say?
The report underscores the Secretary General's consistent message that no one serving under the UN flag should be associated in any way with sexual exploitation and abuse. It remains one of his key priorities. Those 4 areas are putting victims at the center of our efforts, both to prevent sexual exploitation and abuse and to respond rapidly and effectively when it occurs. Secondly, to end impunity, to work more closely with the member states on the proper types of judicial and administrative proceedings to ensure that those who are guilty of these acts are held to justice. Third, to increase our partnership and our openness with member states also, but importantly with civil society, to bring in outside ideas and energies and initiatives. And then finally, to strengthen our communications on all aspects of this issue, including, importantly, the realization that very often gender awareness lies at the heart of these crimes.
Sherwin, the abuse...
And Francis, just to emphasize the point, really, if I may just jump in before you come back, just to emphasize the point, troop-contributing countries like South Africa, what you call TCCs, are responsible for investigating allegations of crimes by their troops. They're responsible for prosecuting, or certainly for setting up prosecutorial mechanisms, often that are in location, on the ground, where these missions or where these alleged crimes take place. And so the difficulty that the United Nations, even though it has a zero-tolerance approach to this, is that they cannot necessarily enforce it. What we did see, though, from the Security Council in 2016 is it empowered the Secretariat to not target individuals who might be accused, but to remove entire contingents when they see these allegations come to the fore. And that was the big concern with the SANDF as it pertains to the DRC. I think there was a frustration that even though South Africa was reacting very fluidly and very quickly to allegations, there was a concern that it wasn't stemming the tide. And so at the end of the day, one of the last leverage points for this UN Secretary General is to remove entire contingents if addressing individual cases doesn't change behavior, broadly speaking. I apologize for interrupting you.
No problem. It's interesting what you've raised, because then how do you reform and get your troops back and say we're going to behave on the ground? Is that sorted out yet?
Well, and there's also there's not one shoe-fits-all approach here. There are different contingents. You have over 71 troop-contributing countries in the world. You have different judicial systems in these countries. You have different sort of military tribunals. And so it really is about best practice and sharing ideas between these TCCs. What the Secretary General has also come up with, Francis, is a voluntary compact that presidents or prime ministers then sign up onto on behalf of their governments. This was introduced at the high-level General Assembly in September 2017. My understanding is South Africa has not signed up to this compact yet, but will be doing so in the weeks ahead. And really what this compact does, on a voluntary basis, it says we are committed to the steps and the measures that the UN wants to see in terms of stamping out sexual exploitation and abuse. We are going to go hand in hand in partnership with working with the Secretariat here in dealing with and eradicating sexual abuse and exploitation.
So on the one hand, there's abuse. Elsewhere in Bloemfontein today, 55 people who died were remembered. We ran a poll tonight, Sherwin, I don't know if you heard, 2/3 of South Africans who voted saying they like that soldiers are involved. But has the UN sort of been lobbying for this, telling the world why it's so important that countries rally together and be willing to cross borders to help?
Very much so. And one of the problems, Francis, when a conflict theatre is determined by the Security Council in terms of needing UN intervention, possibly a peacekeeping mission, the difficulty often is that the Secretariat then takes 5 to 7 months to be in constituting the troop levels required for whatever mission it is. You know, some of the more recent missions in Mali or the Central African Republic, you know, there were wars going on and the Security Council had taken a decision to institute these and to establish these missions, but it then takes the head of peacekeeping operations, the head of field support, 7 months to you know, find the troop contributors and the troop numbers that are required to put boots on the ground. That is a constant problem. We see the bigger countries stepping back into the fray now. We see Canada coming back. But countries like the United States, for example, will make huge financial contributions. But I think there's some domestic legislation here that prevents them from actually providing troop boots on the ground. So that is a constant battle. There are also concerns around equipment, whether you have the requisite number of Apache helicopters or helicopters that can transport in very rural locations. I mean, if you think about the Central African Republic, you think about the Maghreb in Mali, these are very, very complicated areas where you don't necessarily have tarred roads. Think of South Sudan, for example. So this is a very complex theatre, I think more complex than you would find perhaps in normal conflict zones. And the UN really does struggle to come up with those numbers. In fact, was very disappointed when South Africa withdrew its contingents from Darfur. But this is a constant battle and a constant conversation that happens between troop-contributing countries and the UN Secretariat.
All right, thank you very much. UN and New York correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease reporting there on International Peacekeeping Day. And of course, South Africa has definitely been integrally involved, but he did raise some of those issues with our own troops.